All right, today we're going to talk about how the civil rights movement was a success. And to start out, we're going to talk about the case Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And basically, this case was a man in the South, Homer Plessy, sat in a whites only cab on a train and was arrested for doing this. And basically, the case moved all the way up to Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that if if you had separate but equal facilities, then it was okay. So the segregation in the South stood at this time, and then all they had to do was make sure that these facilities that split up blacks and whites were equal. But obviously the black facilities weren't as kept up as the white facilities.
So this went on, segregation went on for 50 years, and even in the 1950s, 50 years later, half the nation's black families lived in poverty. The facilities are still segregated, labeled white and colored, and 40% of the nation's 28 million school children studied in legally segregated schools. So,
In 1954, we have the Brown versus Board of Education case, and basically this started out in Topeka, Kansas, with trying to desegregate schools in the South, and what they wanted to do was make it so African Americans could go to school with white folk. And first, it was denied, and made it all the way up to the Supreme Court, where they ended up ruling that that it violated the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause within that, and so basically it was a good step for the civil rights movement of desegregating schools and making a step towards full equality for them. And then we have the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, and this started on December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. She was arrested, and this is where Martin Luther King really started to come into play in the civil rights movement. He organized the Montgomery bus boycott, which was a year-long boycott where they did not ride the buses in Montgomery, and they would walk places, and that really obviously hurt the bus system. And in our document analysis book, in document 168, he is holding a meeting at the Holt Street Church, and basically goes on to talk about how Rosa Parks was an icon for them, and was doing the right thing and standing up what she believed in. But MLK also preached nonviolent protests, and that he thought that one of the best way to instill change in the society was by peacefully protesting, and this way was in an example of the Montgomery bus boycott. And a quote from this document is, "And I want to say that we are not here advocating violence. We have never done that. I want it to be known throughout Montgomery and throughout the nation that we are Christian people. We believe in Christian religion, and we believe in the teachings of Jesus. The only weapon we have in our hands is the weapon of protest." Like I said before, he really believed in nonviolent protests, and this was a great example of how the civil rights movement was nonviolent, and it showed a success when a year later the Supreme Court ordered Montgomery to integrate their bus systems.
so after that happened in 1960, protests began to arise, especially it started out with these sit-ins that would occur, and this started out with 4 students from a school, all-black school in North Carolina. These students entered a department store, and after they made their purchases, they went to a lunch bench and wanted to get served, but the server refused to serve them. So they sat there until the store closed, the store closed, and did that repetitively. And as they did this, people started to join them, and a revolution began to happen. In 1961, freedom rides began to happen. Now, this was groups of people that would travel by bus into the Deep South to test compliance with courts banning segregation on interstate buses. Now, as they would do this, people would attack them. The KKK would attack them. They would be lynched. Fire bombs would be thrown at them, and they would even be arrested. Now, their action ultimately did lead to the Interstate Commerce Commission to order buses and terminals to be desegregated. Now, in 1963, Birmingham was a city that was riots and protests were happening. There was a ton of violence, whites on blacks, and this was a place where Martin Luther King was called by the protest leaders in the South to come and help out. And he actually got arrested 9 days for violating a ban on demonstrating protests. And he wrote a letter in this jail, in jail, which is document 169 from the document analysis book. And he, in this document, he's basically telling the clergymen and white moderates that his time there is worthwhile, and he's criticizing them because they criticized him for going and saying you shouldn't be here, it's unwise, it's untimely, and he was like, no, it's not. I'm here because he says, when you see your vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you've seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society. He goes on and tells the problems that African Americans face during this time, and just goes to prove the point why he's there and telling the white moderates that you guys are wrong. So,
in 1963, one of the most iconic moments in the civil rights movement happened, and it was the March on Washington. And this was another demonstration held by Martin Luther King, and basically it was a political rally in Washington to voice the African American hardships that they were facing and the social challenges that they faced. And obviously this is where the I Have a Dream speech occurred, and it was one of the most iconic and powerful speeches, and it really did a lot to help the civil rights movement. So one of the biggest pieces of legislation passed that helped the civil rights movement was the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And this started with JFK. He called for a bill that would do something about racial segregation. And when he was assassinated, this responsibility kind of went to Lyndon Johnson. And he basically voiced his opinion for a society where there was no segregation in schools and in the workplace and restaurants. So basically just equal opportunity and equal facilities for everybody, and everyone used the same stuff. And basically it got signed into law on July 2nd, 1964, and it was a huge success for the civil rights movement. It showed that their peaceful protests and what Martin Luther King was preaching was paying off, and that they ended segregation and could move forward in helping African Americans have a good life.
And then 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. It began by King launching a voting rights campaign in Alabama where only 355 out of 15,000 blacks were allowed to vote. He attempted a march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, and right as he got out of the city, police began to attack the march and arrested them. And this was broadcasted all over television. This actually became aware nationally because of because it was televised, and it compelled the government to take action. So Johnson went to Congress and said, "Hey, let's pass a bill that prohibits racial discrimination in voting." So that's what happened, and they got the right to vote. So document 172, it was about Lyndon Johnson, his opinion on the whole civil rights movement, and he firmly believed that the nation should be in a colorblind society, and he says in the document, Negro poverty is not white poverty. He's saying that the blacks face a lot more challenges than the whites face, and this needs to be brought attention nationwide. And he's this document is pretty much him saying that he's one of the biggest contributors to the civil rights movement. That the nation needs to take action. So
Today, obviously, the gap between the races, like everyone has pretty much equal opportunity in our country. An African American has just the same opportunity for a job or education as a white person would. Obviously, there's things like Black Lives Matter and police brutality that still go on today, which is unfortunate. But I do think the civil rights movement was very successful in achieving what they wanted to do, which was make it so their children and future African Americans would have that same opportunity, would not have to go through what they had to go through in these in the 50s and 60s, and obviously back when the 1800s with the Civil War and slavery and whatnot. So they did a good job of getting their point across, doing it peacefully, and instilling change throughout American society. Thank you.